All right, thanks, folks. Hey, folks, I'm Hannes. I'm an engineering manager and architect on JIRA, which I'm sure some of you are using or have been using in the past. What we are doing in JIRA land these days is we're giving JIRA a big usability update or UX update. So we're going from this well-known but maybe a little bit dusty design to this, which I think is looking much fresher and actually also much easier to use. I'm super keen to hear your feedback if you're JIRA users at the bar. So that said, JIRA is actually a pretty old piece of code. So the first version of JIRA dates back to 2002. So on my personal Top Gun to Top Gun 2 timeline, JIRA 1.0 is actually closer to Top Gun. That's mind-blowing. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is there's quite a bit of legacy that JIRA is carrying around. So when we said we are starting this UX update, we also saw this as an opportunity to get rid of all the jQuery and all the backbone garbage that has been lying around, and really create a nice modern web stack. So there's a bit of logo born behind me, but I think the most interesting row is really the first one. So it's a I want to say relatively traditional React Redux architecture, rx.js for side effects, using style components quite heavily. Storybooks are awesome, and the whole thing is float typed. So I think this is pretty neat, pretty modern web stack. Plus, there is quite a bit of surface area in JIRA. It's a large and complicated tool, or powerful tool. So it wasn't too surprising that our new front-end repository that hosts all the new front-end grew quite quickly. So these are the numbers from yesterday. We're talking 600K lines of code, and actually more than 150 individual contributors. Obviously, not everybody was contributing a whole lot of code to that, but still, right? So when I'm talking about world-class front-end engineering at scale, this is the scale that we're talking about. So what I would like to do today is really just share a couple of lessons that we learned over the last 14 or so months when we were working on that. I think there are a lot of React projects out there, but I think there are not so many in that scale. So I figured there may be some interesting aspects to that. So I would like to start with the first and maybe the most powerful learning, actually, divide and conquer. What do I mean by that? So I think most of you probably know the high-level architecture of Flux, right? You have your state, you have your view. Whenever the state changes, you re-render your view, you dispatch your actions, close the full cycle. Somewhere along the way, you do your side effects. All nice and tidy. Everybody understands that beautiful unidirectional flow of control. In reality, however, if you build a really large application, it looks far more like that, right? State is huge, hard to control, a true monster, the same for the output, and the side effects, right? Every single one of them is cute, but you have so many, Jesus. So it's really hard, right? And we don't want that. So let's look at a concrete JIRA application for a second. Sorry, JIRA screen. So this is a JIRA issue, if you know it, opened in a modal. If you have good eyes, you can see that there is a board, a software board in the background, and on the left-hand side, from your perspective, there is a navigation bar. So obviously, we could build this as one large React Redux app, right? It would probably just look like that, right? It would be really hard, a lot of code to manage. So do we want that? Nope. Now that we already divided our view into kind of logical pieces, why wouldn't we build a navigation app that just deals with navigation state, just deals with navigation view, just deals with navigation side effects? Sounds reasonably easy, right? And we could do the same for the board. Just build a board app that deals with board concerns, and finally build an issue app that deals with issue concerns. And this is actually what we do in JIRA. We call this an app, and that's really, I think, the main concept in our code base. When two JIRA developers talk to each other, you will hear the word app quite a bit, not in the mobile context, but in the JIRA context. So what's an app? An app really just combines a view with a bit of state and optionally some side effects. Nothing special, right? The important thing is just that that whole thing is clearly bounded through a JSX interface. So that whole thing is really just a component, right? A very powerful, but still just a React component that retrieves all its data through props and fires all its events also through its props. All the internals really don't really matter, right, from a consumer perspective. So I very consciously called this state, didn't call this store, because we may use redux, but it actually doesn't matter, right? Use component state, use unstated, use whatever makes you happy. The only thing that is important is from the outside, it's just a component. So you get to that really nice setup where if you want to render an issue, which is actually a pretty complicated piece of logic, there are a lot of fields that you can show or not show, all you need to do is mount that component and pass in the issue key. The component would retrieve all its data by itself and render nicely. And if you're actually interested in a change event, sure, be my guest, register an on-change handler, easy enough, right? So the question remains though, now that I have my different apps, navigation, board, issue, how to actually wire them up, right? How do they play together? It's actually quite simple. The only thing that you need is you need some kind of orchestration layer on top of that that actually just wires the properties of the different components together. Now that looks a little bit complicated, but really try to think of an app just as a component, right? And if you would look at the setup like this, so it says there's a text field that shows some value, and there's a button with the label submit, and if you click it, we do something with the value. I think everybody who did a bit of React development came across that, and everybody can solve that, right? It's trivial. Use Redux, use component state, use whatever makes you happy. Now, really, you can just replace the input here with an issue, and you can replace the button with the board. You're dealing with more complicated components, right? But the logic is still the same. Super trivial to wire up. So if you now call bullshit on me and say, dude, you're talking about divide and conquer, but really, it's just composition. You're right. It is really just composition. There's nothing special about that. I really just want to point out that if you work on something as large as JIRA, you want to get this right? You want to get your composition vision, your architectural vision right from the get-go. The second lesson that I would like to talk about, ownership. I think we've all been there, done that, work in a really large code base where some code exists that really nobody feels responsible for, right? It's there, but nobody owns it. It's a nightmare. It's terrible. It's a clear indication that everything is going south. We experienced that a little bit in JIRA and wanted to get it under control ASAP. So what we did is we built a system around what we call manifests. So a manifest is really just a JSON file that specifies an owner. And all code that lives next to that manifest file or in subfolders is owned by this individual, by this team. And that's if you commit a code that is not associated with a manifest JSON, we fail your build. So there's no code that does not have a clear owner defined somewhere. And that's already useful. So I can look at our directory base app, I spare the details, and I can immediately see that my buddy Kamil is the owner of that app. Beautiful. We did something more though. We built a little bot that for reasons that I never fully understood was called Gollum. And what it does is it's really just a Bitbucket bot, would work on GitHub as well. Who uses GitHub? That monitors your changes, the changes that you're committing in your PR, and figures out if you are touching code that is not actually owned by you and your team. And if you do that, it automatically adds reviewers from that other team to the PR. So there's no sneaking through little subtle changes. There's no unintentionally screwing something up. Works really nicely for us. Lesson number 3, being opinionated. That is a more interesting one, I think. So with that concept of an app and that clear ownership, what we have in our JIRA frontend repo is, from a high-level perspective, it's really nice and tidy, right? We have all those little boxes that represent an app, have their clear API. You may wire them up in whatever way you want, all good. If you look at an individual app, if you're honest with yourself, they're actually all quite similar from a conceptual level, right? They are all React Redux based in our case. They all follow our design guidelines. They all use our component library. They all talk to JIRA REST endpoints. They all do this and that. So they're actually not that different. And you would reckon that all these boxes in JIRA frontend are actually coded in a somewhat similar way or structured in a somewhat similar way. However, what we figured out is that we're really talking apples and pears here, and a whole lot of other fruits, which really means that we have, and I'm simplifying a little bit here, but we got to a point where we had, let's say, 50 apps and 50 different architectures. Now, is that cool? I don't think so, because it made the whole repository incredibly difficult to reason about, right? So you get used to one app, then at some point you want to look at another app, and it's a whole bloody new universe. You don't even know where to start, right? Everything's upside down. But we could probably deal with that. I think the more frustrating part is actually that you get really, really bad in sharing code and sharing knowledge, right? Because you kind of start solving the same problems all over again. You think you find a really good solution on structuring your Redux reducer, great, but who knows, maybe another app has solved it much better already. And even if I figure it out, I may not be able to use it, right? Because the whole big picture is just completely different, and that solution may be great, but it doesn't work for me. So that's all very frustrating. So what we kicked off in JIRA, so that's the JIRA internal announcement slide, was a program called Tangerine, where we really kind of rallied our forces and said that we as an engineering team need to become opinionated on what are the right patterns, practices, and technologies to build a large-scale React application, right? If we can't figure that out, nobody can. So the goal was to define these principles and make sure that everybody is happy with them and everybody actually uses them. So on a higher level, what we wanted to achieve is we wanted to get from this basket of fruits to something like that, right? Sure, every app still has a slightly different flavor, every app has a slightly different color, some are bigger, some are smaller, that's all fine, but they should at least follow the same world-class high-level principles. So the process, if you want, that we decided to use for that is decide, document, do, where decide is probably the hardest part, really. So if you think about problem solving, the first part is actually always to find different solutions to your problem, right? And the larger your team, the more brains you can use, the better solutions you will find. So that's great, right? The more people, the better. The more, the merrier. It gets really hard, though, if you get to the point where from all the different solutions that people were finding, you actually want to agree on one. That's really fucking hard, right? So there's a lot of shrugging going on. And I think we've been all in that. We've all been in a situation like that. You know, if Roland and I disagree on something, we can get in front of a whiteboard and sort it out, right? There's no problem with that. But if there are 150 people, that gets really, really hard. So what we established in JIRA is a pretty rigid process of how an idea, a problem, if you want, goes from a very rough idea to a principle that is locked in and final and should be used by everyone. Doesn't mean that it may not get changed in the future, but for the time being, this is how we do. Actually similar to the process that the ECMAScript committee is using for language adaptions. That whole process is guided, is facilitated by a dedicated front-end committee, which is really a bunch of principal developers, architects, folks who know what they're doing. These are not the actual members of the committee, though I would really love to have Marko and Arnautovic on it. But I think the most important thing is we're representing different parts of our organization, which is quite challenging in a team as large as JIRA, actually. We have a couple of external advisors. So these are folks who are from different parts of Atlassian or even from completely outside the company. And there are a couple of seats that we are rotating in and out so that we get some fresh insights, some fresh bloods to the committee. That's working quite nicely, actually. And we identified, or we locked in a couple of really good principles in JIRA. High-level app folder structure, hard one. Very spicy. Took us a while to figure it out, but I think we're quite happy with that now. But there are more that are less controversial, I guess. No. How do you compose your smart component and your dumb components? How do you compose your reducers? It's not rocket science, right? You just want to pick one principle and stick to it. And really, like the small nitty-gritties, like in Flow, do you use the one notation or do you use the other notation? Is it the most important thing of the world? Nope. Is it one less thing to worry about? 100% absolutely. So we actually have a pretty rich set of principles these days, which the next step would be to document. So we'll put that on something like this. Don't search for it, doesn't exist yet. Coming soon. That will be awesome. And finally, do, right? We have our principles, we have documented them. It's now time to actually implement them and code them. And that's really the easy part, right? Every engineer loves building good code. Every engineer loves following good, strong principles. The only thing that engineers love even more than doing that themselves is have a robot do it for them. Which brings me to our fourth and last learning, radically automate. So in JIRA, we developed quite a passion, if not obsession, with all forms of static code analysis, mostly ESLint. So we actually have a ton, so we use all the standard ESLint rule, right? Airbnb configuration or whatever the standard is, we use that, no doubt about that. But then we have a ton of custom rules that we actually coded for JIRA-specific principles that live either in our code base directly, or we're in the process of open sourcing some particularly good ones. And it's actually quite an interesting experience to code in JIRA, because you write your code, the moment when you hit save, you may get something quite different from what you typed before, which takes a bit to get used to, but it's actually incredibly cool. So I just want to share my favorite rule. Just want to brag about it because it's so fucking cool. Look at that. I don't know about you, but for me, this makes me sick. Right? Look at all the imports. There's no structure. There's no sorting. There are library imports. There are relative imports. There are absolute imports. There are imports down the hierarchy. There are imports up the hierarchy. I hate it. So what you can do in JIRA is just press save, and you get this. Isn't that beautiful? Group by kind of import. Is it a module? Is it relative? Is it absolute? Alphabetically sorted. There's a bit of semantic sorting in there as well that you can configure. I love it. So much less time spent on ranting in BRs and arguing on whether that import should be on top of the other one or not. It's just locked in. That's how we do. Another thing that we developed, and that's actually open source already, is a thing called Stricta. So Stricta is quite similar to ESLint, but it doesn't so much focus on individual files, what ESLint does, but really focuses on a project as a whole. My favorite rule there is the circular dependency rule, which identifies circles, but not only on file level, but on folder level. So think about this. Let's say you have a view folder that contains all your React stuff, and you have a state folder that contains all your Redux stuff. It's perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable that view imports from state, because after all, you gotta render something, right? You gotta get your data from somewhere. Now, what could happen, and it actually happens quite often, is that somebody, for whatever reason, introduces some dependency from state back to view, which is shit, right? You shouldn't do that. And Stricta will tell you, and Stricta will break your build. So we are talking about a unidirectional dependency graph, or directed dependency graph, which is pretty awesome. Another thing that we use Trickster for, and that is just to indicate how opinionated we are, is a rule that defines the structure of an app really on a file name and folder name basis. So don't read this configuration, it's not important. But what you may or may not be able to see here is that all the different apps that we have actually look very similar if you look at them in the IDE, right? So there's no I name this file this, you name this file that. It's just all naming it the same, which allows you to build a really strong mental model of how an app works. It makes it really easy to jump into one if you want to change something. So this really rounds it up for me. So I think number one learning for me is divide and conquer. If I'm stating the complete obvious to you, that's great. If that's not the case, then think about it when building your next React application. Next one is generate, and I guess support some sense of ownership. Yeah, seen that, manifest JSON. There are different ways to do that. This one is really strict in that it guarantees that no file doesn't actually have an owner. Be opinionated. That's, I guess, a bit of a controversial one, and it has been controversial within JIRA as well. But my personal recommendation is don't be afraid, don't shy away from being opinionated across teams, right? Sure, there may be some pushback. Everybody is proud and opinionated on their way of doing, but in the long run, you will have more effective and actually happier people in your organization. And last but not least, automate the shit out of it, right? So you can agree on all the principles of the world. If nobody follows them, they're worthless, right? And one way to do that is just keep an eye on it in PRs, but we all know how humans are, right? Things slip through and you get that broken window theory where slowly everything falls apart. Robots don't make these mistakes if done right. So have a look at ESLint. At the ESLint docs, it's actually great fun to do that. I love nothing more than writing a casual ESLint rule in the evening. Brilliant. That's it for me. As Atlassian, the company that I work for, was kind enough to sponsor this event, I can say a few words about Atlassian. So Atlassian doesn't only build JIRA, but also builds a couple of other tools that you may or may not know. So Atlassian builds Confluence, Bitbucket, and also Trello, all products that help teams to work together more effectively. Headquarters in Sydney, but we have large engineering offices also in Austin and New York City, and also in the Bay Area. So there's Mountain View, there's San Francisco. There are a couple of other offices around the world. So I just spent a week in beautiful Gdansk in Poland, and there are actually a couple of folks working from Austria remotely. And we're hiring really across all these offices. I personally hire for Sydney, but in general, we're hiring everywhere and across all usual roles. So front-end is certainly a big focus area, but there's always happy to hire full-stack developers and back-end developers as well. So if you're interested, I'll stick around for a bit. Let's grab a beer together. I have a couple of these t-shirts here that I happily trade for contact information, so just grab me. On a more personal note, I actually relocated myself from Vienna to Sydney a couple of years ago. It is a really good place to live. That's actually from my apartment window, so a good place to have your morning coffee. Very open society, brought my girlfriend, she obviously likes it as well. The only thing that I really miss is good old Grießnockerlsuppe. So every time I fly from Vienna to Sydney, this is what my suitcase looks like. This is it for me. Thanks, folks.